Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 13. This week we'll be talking about postmodernism, feminism, identity, and the body. Sorry, got a little something caught in my throat. So before I talk a little bit about the content, I just want to say that I have grading done through week 11. I'll be working on week 12 in a couple of days. We do not have a quiz or a journal entry or a discussion this week. So the idea is to spend the week really digging into the content, but also getting a head start on your paper if you haven't started already. So I hope that works well for you in terms of having a little break, in terms of direct engagement with this week's topic. That said, I hope you really look at this week very carefully and recognize that we're at a really important point in the development of the art of the 1960s and more broadly the development of postmodern art. So I think let me just go through the actual pieces of the week, and then I want to talk a little bit about postmodernism. So the idea is to read chapter 19 in Gompertz. And when you're reading in the book, always think about, for some of you, you might want to read the book first and then watch the lecture. And for people who tend to take things in better initially by seeing them, in other words, by learning visually, you might want to watch the video and then read the chapter. So that's really up to you. There's also a reading of a classic essay by Linda Nochlin called "Why Have There Been No Great Artists?" The lecture talks a little bit about the content of this essay, which was very controversial and has, in the period since it was published in the 60s, has become a major critical piece with regard to feminist art. And it basically asks, why in art history have women been closed out of the possibility of becoming great artists? Well, the thing is that really since this period in the 1960s, the art world opens up tremendously to women. It takes a while, and it comes in fits and starts, and it's still problematic in some ways. However, there are many more highly regarded women artists today than there were then. But this is the work that we're talking about today in many ways opens the door for that. There's also, I would like you to watch 3 short videos from the Art21 website. Ooh, I see I put a typo in here. That should say Art21. I'm going to fix that. The Art21 is a series of contemporary art from PBS that profiles contemporary artists around the idea of sort of different topics. They do a great job talking about the artist's concepts as well as their processes and the historical context of their work. So check out these short videos on Janine Antoni, Kiki Smith, and Cindy Sherman. All right. The lecture is about a half an hour, and it's really a good overview of feminist art in the mid and late 60s, and a lot of this work continues into the 70s. I also put I'm going to just skip this for right now. I want to come back to it, but I put a list of concepts that compares modernism and postmodernism. I'll come back to that in a minute. Here is the Linda Nochlin, and there is the website on Judy Chicago's dinner party that I will want you to check out. There's some more readings if you're interested on the dinner party, and then here are the 3 videos that are from Art21 right here. So let's go back to this, because I think postmodernism is such a big term, right? And I don't think we're going to have time to really grapple with it in its entirety. Well, it's almost impossible to grapple with it in its entirety. But I think that the thing that's really important to point out is that something big seems to happen in the 50s and really by 1960. It's pretty clear that we are emerging as a post-industrial society where the values of modernism seem to be retreating in favor of their, what might be called their opposite. In other words, modernism, which had long been the idea that artists and other people engaged in culture were rebelling against convention, by the late 1950s, modernism is the convention that is rebelled against. But what's interesting about this, a lot of the seeds of postmodernism were really already established as far back as Dada. This kind of this sentiment that might be called anti-art or anti-modern. I don't want to go through all of these things on the list, and some of these terms are extremely complex. I don't expect you to look these up, but I want to just point out a few things. If modernism was, say, a period of symbolism, right, where there was such an emphasis on meaning, what, say, an abstract canvas might convey as a symbol, think of Pollock, think of Rothko, right, that suddenly we're much more interested in this idea of a kind of Dada, an art that can't really find a way to make meaning in a culture that is potentially beyond, or where meaning or symbol can't be redeemed. In modernism, if there was an idea that everything had purpose or design, right, careful intention, suddenly in postmodernism, it becomes more and more evident that things are grounded in the idea of play, which maybe doesn't have strict rules, and chance. So if modernism is hierarchical, then maybe postmodernism is anarchical, right? Where modernism respects mastery, maybe postmodernism, think of Warhol, right? It's sort of this idea of, I'm just throwing these images on canvas, silk screening them as if they're just, any other object coming off an assembly line. So it isn't so much about the perfection or the skill of the artist as it is about laying the world bare, right? And showing us who we are as consumers, really almost like showing our superficiality. If modernism is about presence, again, that's sort of that deep emotional way of being in the world, then postmodernism is absence. Let's see. So if modernism is about rootedness and depth, right? Think of artists engaging in the world of emotion, of symbol, of color as representation of emotion, the unconscious, exploring Freud, exploring Jung, then suddenly we see something different happening here with postmodernism, where it seems to be more about, imagine like tropical grass that grows on the surface by connecting rhizomatically, right? It creeps across instead of going down and creating deep roots. You could almost argue that our social network culture is a kind of a form of this way of networking that goes out and keeps growing like a web, but maybe doesn't go down. An interest in what is signified, right? Imagine you look at something and you say, oh, that represents this, right? That represents love. That represents beauty. Well, as someone could argue in postmodernism, we're more involved in the sign itself. Maybe, a heart represents love, but we don't maybe look past the sign, right? We stay focused on the sign instead of what the sign represents. Okay, so that what I'm trying to sort of point out here is that postmodernism is a period where we seem to lose faith in depth, in symbolism. And if you look at pop art, you can see that there's, it really does seem, if we look at these particular items here on this list, the superficiality of pop art seems to be representative of postmodernism. Postmodernism is also known for combining a lot of information that might seem like it doesn't go together. Think of the Hamilton collages, right? Where we're just grabbing all these signs out of the universe and throwing them together in a soup, in a way, like an ABC soup of just unrelated ideas. Now, that might be the thrust of postmodernism, right? And, one thing that I haven't really talked much about with regard to postmodernism is the way that it tackles the idea of truth. If modernism was always searching for truth, postmodernism potentially questions whether we can ever really arrive at truth. And what's interesting is a lot of people who are, involved in the idea of really wondering what is postmodern culture. The talk today about being in a post-truth era really rings as plausible to people who have been saying for a couple of decades now that we seem to be merging into a kind of a post-truth era. So keep that in mind. So the work today is really looking at feminist art in the 60s, but particularly feminist art that either acknowledges performance or makes work related to the body in a way that acknowledges or potentially intersects or overlaps a little bit with performance art. So I've mentioned before about the period of the 1960s. I'll just reiterate again, keep in mind when you're looking at this work, what's happening in society. It's really remarkable that we have a period of social unrest, starting with the civil rights movement in the late 50s. We have an environmental movement emerging in the early 60s, a student movement emerging in the early 60s, and a feminist movement emerging especially around mid-1960s. And what's really interesting is that women artists for the first time are really drawing from that collective energy of the feminist movement to critique the institutions of art, to really ask why more women artists aren't shown in galleries, aren't collected in museums, why women seem to be the subject of art produced by men, but are not given the credit for having the ability, the intellect, to the creative drive to create great art. So what women do is draw on the energy of the women's movement, band together and create co-op art galleries, women-only art galleries, women's discussion groups, and consciousness-raising environments where women can talk about what it feels like to be a woman producing art in an art world that seems to only allow a very few women in, if at all. They touch on issues of domesticity, of a woman's responsibility in the domestic world, on motherhood, on the sort of the pleasures as well as the inhibitions of the body. So I think you'll find this work interesting if you look at it, well, for its own sake, but also for the fact that it is very political at the same time. So enjoy this week. And if you have any questions, of course, let me know. I have grading done I've graded for this week that you're just finishing now. I'll do that in a couple of days. And we're really heading into the home stretch here.